Chris Benson sat alone in his office at 2 in the morning, the glow of 6 monitors casting pale blue light across his face. He had promised himself he wouldn't do this anymore, promised himself he would trust the process, trust the people he hired, trust that his son was safe. But promises made in daylight have a way of dissolving in the dark. His finger hovered over the mouse. One click and he could see every corner of the house. The kitchen, the hallways, Bruno's room. He clicked. The feed from Bruno's bedroom filled the center screen. The timestamp in the corner read 2:14 a.m. And there, in the dim glow of a nightlight shaped like a crescent moon, was Grace Peters, the new maid he'd hired only 10 days ago. She was kneeling beside Bruno's bed, her back to the camera, her hand reaching towards something Chris couldn't see. His stomach dropped. Bruno was awake. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. Grace leaned closer, too close. Her hand moved again, this time toward Bruno's chest. Chris's hand shot toward the intercom button on his desk. One press and he could demand an explanation. One press and he could end whatever this was. But then Bruno's face changed. The tension in his jaw softened. His eyes, usually dull and distant, flickered with something Chris hadn't seen in 3 years. Curiosity. Maybe even comfort. Grace's hand wasn't pushing. It was resting, gently, on Bruno's shoulder. And she was humming, low and steady, a melody Chris didn't recognize but felt in his chest. Bruno's lips moved. Chris turned up the volume. "Again," Bruno whispered. Grace nodded and hummed the same melody, slower this time, her hand tapping a soft rhythm against the blanket. Chris leaned back in his chair, heart pounding, shame creeping up his spine. He had been ready to accuse her, ready to assume the worst. And yet, here she was, doing something he couldn't name. Something that looked nothing like the care manuals or therapy schedules or expensive consultations he'd paid for. It looked like connection. Chris Benson had built an empire on foresight, discipline, and control. He had turned a single software patent into a multinational corporation, survived hostile takeovers, navigated boardrooms filled with sharks. But none of that had prepared him for the moment 3 years ago when a police officer knocked on his door and told him his son had been hit by a car, a reckless driver, a red light ignored. A 12-year-old boy on his way home from soccer practice, his whole life ahead of him, reduced in an instant to medical terms Chris didn't understand. Spinal cord injury, paraplegia, permanent. The word permanent had felt like a sentencing. Bruno Ferdinand Benson had been a whirlwind of a kid. Loud, fearless, always moving. He climbed trees, scraped knees, asked 1,000 questions a day. After the accident, the questions stopped. The movement stopped. The light in his eyes dimmed to something Chris could barely recognize. Chris had thrown everything at the problem. The best doctors, the best therapists, the best equipment money could buy. He renovated the entire mansion to be accessible, installed ramps and rails and automated doors. He hired a rotating staff of nurses, physical therapists, occupational therapists, nutritionists. He tracked Bruno's progress in spreadsheets, monitored his medication schedules, optimized his routines down to the minute. And yet, Bruno only seemed to retreat further. Chris's marriage hadn't survived it. His wife, Caroline, had loved Bruno fiercely, but grief had carved a canyon between them. She blamed Chris for working late the night of the accident, for not being there to pick Bruno up. Chris blamed himself, too, but he couldn't say it out loud, so they lived in silence until she moved out, citing irreconcilable differences. The divorce was quiet, expensive, and final. Now it was just Chris and Bruno in a house too big for 2 people, surrounded by staff who came and went like ghosts. Chris had installed the cameras 6 months after the accident, not because he didn't trust people, because he'd learned he couldn't afford not to. There had been incidents, small at first. a nurse who raised her voice when Bruno refused to eat, a therapist who cut a session short when she thought no one was watching, a maid who yanked Bruno's wheelchair too roughly through a doorway, leaving a bruise on his arm. Each time Chris had intervened. Each time he'd replaced the staff member. Each time he told himself the cameras were necessary. They were protection. They were safety. But watching his son's life through a screen had started to feel like a different kind of wound. So he'd stopped. For weeks, he hadn't opened the feeds. He told himself he was learning to trust again. And then the previous maid, a woman named Margaret, who had been with them for 8 months, quit abruptly. She didn't give 2 weeks' notice. She didn't offer an explanation beyond a single sentence. "I can't do this anymore. It's too much." Chris had been furious, then confused, then afraid. What had she seen? What had happened that he didn't know about? He'd reviewed the footage, hours of it, and found nothing. Just Margaret going through the motions, her face growing more tired each day, her interactions with Bruno polite but distant. She hadn't been cruel. She'd just been empty. Chris realized, watching those recordings, that Bruno had been empty too. So he hired Grace Peters. Her resume was plain. No fancy credentials, no glowing references from wealthy families, just 5 years of experience in home care, a certification in basic first aid, and 2 brief letters of recommendation. One from an elderly woman who called Grace patient and kind. Another from a family who said she treated our father with dignity. During the interview, Grace had sat across from Chris in the library, hands folded in her lap, eyes calm. She didn't gush about the house, didn't ask about salary first, didn't try to impress him with buzzwords or promises. She asked one question: "Does Bruno like music?" Chris had blinked, caught off guard. I don't know. He used to. Why?" Grace had smiled just a little. Just wondering. He hired her on the spot. Not because she was impressive, because she was the first person in 3 years who had asked about Bruno as a person, not a patient. If you're the kind of person who believes that small acts of kindness can change a whole life, that compassion can show up in the quietest places, then you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button because stories like this one remind us what it means to be human. And trust me, you'll want to stay for what happens next. The first week with Grace was uneventful. She arrived each morning at 7, prepared breakfast, helped Bruno with his routine, kept the house clean, and left by 6 in the evening. She was efficient, quiet, and professional. Chris barely saw her. He was buried in work, back-to-back meetings, conference calls that stretched into the night. But Bruno noticed her. Chris saw it in small ways. Bruno, who usually wheeled himself to his room and stayed there for hours, started lingering in the kitchen doorway while Grace worked. He didn't speak, just watched. Grace didn't push him to talk. She hummed while she cooked, soft melodies that filled the space without demanding attention. One morning, Chris came downstairs to find Bruno sitting at the kitchen table, a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him. Grace was at the counter, slicing fruit. "Morning," Chris said, surprised. Bruno rarely ate breakfast outside his room. Bruno didn't respond, but he was eating. Slowly but eating. Grace glanced over her shoulder and nodded at Chris. "Good morning, Mr. Benson." Chris poured himself coffee, watching them. Grace moved with a kind of ease that felt deliberate, not rushed, not performative, just present. "Bruno," Chris said carefully, "how are you feeling today?" Bruno shrugged. Grace set a bowl of strawberries on the table. "He told me earlier he slept better last night, didn't you, Bruno?" Bruno glanced at her, then nodded. Chris felt something twist in his chest. When had Bruno started talking to her? The house had other people too. There was Diane, the physical therapist who came 3 times a week. She was competent, methodical, and kind in a clinical way. She followed the exercises exactly as prescribed, tracked Bruno's progress in a binder, and reported to Chris every Friday. There was Nurse Patel, who stopped by twice a week to check Bruno's vitals and manage his medications. She was warm and efficient, always smiling, always in a hurry. There was Richard, the head of Chris's private security team, who managed the camera systems and the estate's perimeter. Richard was the one who had encouraged Chris to install the cameras in the first place. "You can't be too careful," he'd said, "especially with someone vulnerable in the house." And there was Tom, Chris's lawyer, who was still managing the legal aftermath of the accident. The driver who hit Bruno had been uninsured, underemployed, and judgment-proof. There was no money to recover, but there was a civil case, a drawn-out process that Tom said might take years. Recently, Tom had mentioned that the driver's legal team was pushing for a settlement hearing. It was scheduled for 2 weeks from now. Chris had barely registered it. What did money matter? It wouldn't give Bruno his legs back. But now, with the charity gala coming up in 10 days, the timing felt suffocating. The gala. Chris had agreed to host it months ago, back when he thought it would be a good distraction. A fundraiser for spinal cord injury research held at his estate, with investors, donors, and media in attendance. The event coordinator had pitched it as an opportunity to spotlight family resilience and inspire hope. Chris had said yes because he thought it might help Bruno feel less alone, show him that other people were fighting for a cure, for progress, for change. But when Chris mentioned it to Bruno last week, the boy had gone silent. Then he'd said, voice flat, "I'm not going. Bruno, it's at our house. You don't have to do anything. Just be there." I said no. Chris hadn't pushed, but the gala was in 10 days and he had no idea how to fix this. That evening, Chris was in his office reviewing contracts when he heard something that made him pause. Humming, soft, rhythmic, coming from somewhere downstairs. He stood, walked to the hallway, and listened. It was Grace, in the kitchen. And then, faintly, he heard another sound. Bruno, laughing. Chris's breath caught. He hadn't heard Bruno laugh he couldn't remember how long. He moved quietly down the hall, stopping just outside the kitchen door. He didn't want to interrupt, didn't want to break whatever this was. Through the crack in the door, he saw them. Grace was at the counter, chopping vegetables. Bruno was at the table, a small wooden cutting board in front of him, a butter knife in his hand. He was cutting a bell pepper, slowly, carefully. "Like this?" Bruno asked. "Perfect," Grace said. "You're a natural." Bruno smiled. Small but real. Chris felt his throat tighten. When was the last time someone had let Bruno help with something? When was the last time someone had treated him like he was capable? Grace glanced at Bruno, then said casually, "You know, my grandmother used to say that cooking is just rhythm. Chop, stir, taste, adjust. Like music." Bruno looked up. "You said that before, about music." Grace nodded. "I did." "Why?" Grace paused, then set down her knife. "Because I think rhythm helps when things feel out of control. It gives you something to hold on to." Bruno was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't really listen to music anymore." "Why not?" "I don't know. It just reminds me of before." Grace didn't rush to fill the silence. She just nodded. "That makes sense." Bruno looked down at the pepper in his hands. "Do you like music?" "I do." "What kind?" Grace smiled. "All kinds, but my favorite is anything with a good beat. Something you can feel." Bruno nodded slowly. Then he went back to cutting. Chris stepped away from the door, heart pounding. He didn't know what he'd just witnessed, but it felt important, sacred even. That night, after Grace had left and Bruno was in his room, Chris sat in his office and stared at the monitors. He told himself he wouldn't watch. But insomnia crept in, and guilt, and fear, and before he knew it, he was clicking through the feeds. He found the one from the kitchen earlier that evening, Watch the whole scene again. Watch Grace's patience. Watch Bruno's small smile. Then he switched to the live feed from Bruno's room. The boy was asleep. The room was dark except for the nightlight. Chris was about to close the window when he saw movement. The door opened. Grace stepped inside. Chris's pulse spiked. What was she doing? Her shift had ended hours ago. Grace moved quietly to Bruno's bedside. She didn't touch him, just stood there for a moment, watching him sleep. Then she knelt down, reached into her bag, and pulled something out. Chris zoomed in. It was a small wooden box, old, worn, with a latch on the front. Grace opened it carefully. Inside was something Chris couldn't quite see. She lifted it out, held it in her hands, and then she wound it. A music box. The melody was faint, barely audible through the camera's microphone, but Chris could hear it. Soft, lilting, gentle. Grace set the music box on the nightstand, let it play for a few seconds, then closed it and put it back in her bag. She stood, adjusted Bruno's blanket, and whispered something Chris couldn't hear. Then she left. Chris sat frozen, staring at the screen. What was that? Why did she have a music box? Why did she come back after her shift? And why did it feel like he just witnessed something he wasn't supposed to see? He leaned closer to the screen, replaying the moment, trying to read her lips. But all he could think was, who is Grace Peters? The next morning, Chris woke with a knot in his stomach. He hadn't slept well. The image of Grace in Bruno's room, the music box, the whispered words, it all felt too intimate, too strange. He told himself he was overreacting. She was just being kind, that's all. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something. At breakfast, Bruno was quieter than usual. Grace was in the kitchen preparing oatmeal, humming again. Chris watched her carefully. Grace, can I ask you something? She looked up, calm as ever. Of course. Do you stay late sometimes, after your shift? Grace paused just for a second. Then she nodded. Sometimes. If I think Bruno might need something, I don't charge extra. I just want to make sure he's okay. Chris felt a flicker of guilt. You don't have to do that. I know, Grace said simply, but I want to. Bruno glanced between them, then back down at his plate. Chris wanted to ask more, wanted to ask about the music box, about why she came back, about what she whispered, but he didn't, because part of him was afraid of the answer. That afternoon, Chris had a meeting with Tom, his lawyer. They sat in the library, going over the details of the upcoming settlement hearing. The driver's team is pushing hard, Tom said. They want this over with. They're offering a symbolic settlement, $20,000. It's insulting, but it might be the best we get. Chris barely heard him. His mind was elsewhere. Chris? Tom said. Are you listening? Yeah, fine. Whatever you think is best. Tom frowned. This is about your son. You should care. I do care, Chris snapped. Then he softened. I don't know if any of this matters. Money won't fix him. Tom sighed. No, but it might help you feel like there was some justice. Chris didn't respond. After Tom left, Chris went back to his office. He told himself he wouldn't check the cameras. He checked them anyway. This time, he went back further, reviewed footage from the past week, watched Grace's routines, watched her interactions with Bruno, and he saw things he hadn't noticed before. The way she always knelt down to Bruno's eye level when she spoke to him. The way she narrated her actions, giving him time to process. The way she asked his opinion on small things. Do you want the blue shirt or the gray? I can wait. The way she never rushed him. And then he saw something that made him stop. It was late at night, 3 days ago. Grace was in the living room, sitting on the floor beside Bruno's wheelchair. Bruno was asleep in the chair, his head tilted to one side. Grace wasn't doing anything, just sitting, matching her breathing to his. Chris turned up the volume. Grace's voice was barely a whisper. "You're safe. You're okay. You're more than this." She said it like a mantra, like a promise. Chris felt his chest tighten. Then Grace reached into her bag and pulled out the music box again. She wound it, let it play for a few seconds, then closed it. She stood, adjusted Bruno's blanket, and wheeled him carefully to his room. Chris watched the whole thing, unable to look away. This wasn't just caregiving. This was something else. This was love. And Chris didn't know what to do with that. The next evening, Chris came home early. He didn't plan to. A meeting had been canceled, and for once, he didn't fill the time with work. He walked into the house and heard voices, laughter. He followed the sound to the living room. Grace was sitting on the floor, legs crossed. Bruno was in his wheelchair beside her. Between them were two wooden spoons and a small metal pot. Grace tapped a rhythm on the pot. Bruno watched, then tapped back with his spoon. Grace grinned. Now, faster. Bruno tried, fumbling at first, then finding the beat. They went back and forth, building a rhythm together, and Bruno was laughing, really laughing. Chris stood in the doorway, frozen. Grace looked up and saw him. She didn't stop, just smiled and said, "Want to join?" Chris shook his head, throat tight. "No. I'll just watch." Bruno glanced at his father, then back at Grace. The rhythm continued. Chris sat down on the couch, and for the first time in 3 years, he didn't try to fix anything, didn't try to optimize or control. He just watched his son be a kid again. And he realized, with a sharp and painful clarity, that he had been so focused on protecting Bruno that he'd forgotten to let him live. Later that night, after Grace had gone home and Bruno was asleep, Chris sat in his office and opened the camera feeds one more time. He scrolled back to earlier that evening, watched the rhythm game again. Then he scrolled further, to the night before, and the night before that. He watched Grace sit with Bruno in silence, watched her read to him from an adventure novel, pausing to ask, "What do you think the hero should do?" Watched her guide him through exercises, turning each movement into a game. Watched her celebrate effort, not success. And then he saw the moment that changed everything. It was late, past midnight. Bruno was in the living room, alone. He thought everyone was asleep. The camera caught him in profile. His face was twisted in pain, not physical pain, something deeper. His fist clenched. His breath came in short, sharp gasps, and then he broke. "I hate this," he whispered to the empty room. "I hate this chair. I hate being stuck. I hate—" His voice cracked. Chris's hand moved toward the intercom. He wanted to run downstairs to hold his son, to tell him it would be okay. But then, the door opened. Grace stepped in, still in her clothes from earlier. She must have heard him. She didn't say anything at first, just walked over and knelt in front of Bruno, her face level with his. Bruno looked at her, tears streaming down his face. "I hate this." Grace didn't flinch, didn't offer empty comfort. She just said, "I know." Bruno's breath hitched. "You don't. You can't." Grace was quiet for a long moment, then she said, softly, "Tell me what you miss." Bruno's voice was barely a whisper. "Running." Grace nodded. Then she did something Chris would never forget. She took Bruno's hands and placed them on her legs, on her knees. "Then feel this," she said. She stood slowly, Bruno's hands still resting on her knees, and began to walk in place, slowly, deliberately. "Heel," she said. "Toe, shift, balance. Now breathe." Bruno's hands followed the movement. His eyes were wide, focused. Grace continued. "This is what running feels like. The rhythm, the push, the release. Your body remembers this, Bruno. It's still in you." She walked in place for another minute, narrating every sensation, every shift of weight. Then she knelt again and said, "Different doesn't mean gone." Bruno stared at her, tears still wet on his cheeks. Your body remembers, Grace said. We'll remind it together. Chris watched the screen, his own tears blurring the image. In that moment, he understood. All his money, all his control, all his cameras, none of it had given Bruno hope. Grace had done that without knowing anyone was watching. On a scale of 1 to 10, how is this story landing for you so far? Drop a number in the comments. I'd love to know. Chris didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office replaying the moment over and over. Grace's voice. Different doesn't mean gone. Bruno's face. The way the tension had melted. The way she had given him something Chris couldn't name. Not therapy, not pity, dignity. By morning, Chris had made a decision. He called Grace into his office before her shift started. She stood in the doorway, calm as always, hands folded. "Mr. Benson?" she said. Chris gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Please, sit." Grace sat, her expression unreadable. Chris took a breath. This was harder than any boardroom negotiation he'd ever done. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear me out before you respond." Grace nodded. "There are cameras," Chris said, "throughout the house. I installed them 3 years ago, after Bruno's accident. I told myself it was for his safety, to make sure the staff treated him well, to catch anything that might hurt him." Grace's expression didn't change. Chris continued, his voice thick. "I've been watching the feeds. Not all the time, but recently. And I saw what you did last night, with Bruno, when he broke down." Grace's eyes flickered just slightly. "I saw you help him," Chris said, "in a way I never could. And I need you to know, I'm not proud of the cameras. I'm not proud of watching without your knowledge. But I'm grateful, because you showed me something I'd forgotten." "What's that?" Grace asked quietly. "That protection isn't the same as hope." Grace was silent for a long moment, then she said, "I'm glad you saw the real him, not just the injury." Chris felt his throat tighten. "I want to offer you more, a raise, a contract. Whatever you need, just, please, keep helping him." Grace shook her head. "I don't need more money, Mr. Benson." "Then what do you need?" Grace met his eyes. "Just let me keep helping him, not as a job, as a promise." Chris nodded, unable to speak. Grace stood. "But I do have one condition." "Anything." "The cameras in Bruno's bedroom. Either remove them or tell him they're there. He deserves to know." Chris felt a wave of shame. "You're right. I'll take them down today." Grace nodded. "Thank you." She turned to leave, then paused. "Mr. Benson." "Yes?" "You're a good father. You just forgot that love isn't about control. It's about trust." She left before Chris could respond. He sat alone in his office, staring at the monitors. Then he picked up the phone and called Richard, his security manager. "I need you to remove the cameras from Bruno's room," Chris said. "Today." Richard hesitated. "Are you sure?" "That's one of the most important." "I'm sure." "Okay, I'll send someone over." Chris hung up and closed the camera software. For the first time in 3 years, he felt like he could breathe. But the relief didn't last long. 2 days later, Tom called with bad news. "The settlement hearing got moved up," Tom said. "It's now in 5 days, same day as your gala." Chris cursed under his breath. "Can we reschedule?" "Not without losing leverage. The judge is already annoyed with the delays." "Fine, I'll make it work." But he didn't know how. The gala was in 5 days, the settlement hearing was the same day, and Bruno still refused to attend either. That evening, Chris found Bruno in his room, staring out the window. "Hey," Chris said. Bruno didn't respond. Chris sat down on the edge of the bed. "I know you don't want to go to the gala, and I'm not going to force you. But I need you to understand why it matters to me." Bruno finally looked at him. "Why?" "Because I want people to see that we're still fighting, that we haven't given up, That there's hope. Bruno's jaw tightened. You mean you want them to see me as inspiration? Chris flinched. No, that's not. Yes, it is, Bruno said, voice rising. You want them to look at me and feel good about themselves, like, oh, look at that poor kid in the wheelchair, but he's so brave. I'm not brave, Dad. I'm just stuck. Chris felt his chest tighten. Bruno, I don't want to be your inspiration, Bruno said, tears in his eyes. I just want to be me. Chris didn't know what to say. Bruno turned back to the window. Chris left the room, feeling like he'd failed all over again. That night, he found Grace in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. Grace, he said, can I ask you something? Of course. How do I reach him? How do I make him understand that I'm not trying to use him? I just want him to know he's not alone. Grace set down the dish towel and looked at Chris. You can't make him understand. You can only show him. And showing him means letting him choose, even if he chooses not to go. Chris nodded slowly. You're right, Grace smiled. He'll come around. Just give him time. But time was running out. The next few days were a blur. Chris was juggling gala preparations, legal meetings, and the constant weight of knowing he was failing his son. Richard, his security manager, pulled him aside one afternoon. Chris, I need to talk to you about the cameras. What about them? You removed the ones in Bruno's room. Fine. But I'm hearing rumors. Someone on staff is talking, saying, you've been spying on everyone. Chris's blood ran cold. Who? I don't know. But if this gets out, especially with the gala coming up, it could be a PR nightmare. Chris felt the walls closing in. What do I do? Richard shrugged. You could deny it, or you could own it, but either way, you need to control the narrative. Chris hated that word, control. He thought about what Grace had said. Love isn't about control. It's about trust. I'll handle it, Chris said, but he didn't know how. That evening, Grace found him in the library, staring at nothing. Mr. Benson? She said. He looked up. Grace, I think I made a mistake. What kind of mistake? The cameras. Someone knows. And if it gets out, it's going to ruin everything. The gala. The case. My reputation. Grace sat down across from him. What do you want to do? I don't know. Part of me wants to deny it, bury it, but that feels like lying. Grace nodded. Then don't lie. But if I admit it, then you admit it, Grace said simply. And you explain why. People understand fear. They understand wanting to protect someone you love. What they don't understand is dishonesty. Chris looked at her. You make it sound so simple. It's not simple, Grace said, but it's right. Chris took a breath. Okay, I'll tell the truth. Grace smiled. Good. Then she stood and said, by the way, Bruno asked me something today. What? He asked if I thought he should go to the gala. Chris's heart skipped. What did you say? I said it's his choice, but I also said that sometimes showing up is the bravest thing you can do. Not for other people, for yourself. Chris felt a flicker of hope. Do you think he'll go? Grace shrugged. I don't know, but I think he's thinking about it. That night, Chris couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Bruno, about the gala, about the cameras, about trust. At 2 a.m, he got out of bed and went to Bruno's room. He knocked softly. Bruno, you awake? Yeah? Chris opened the door. Bruno was sitting up in bed, reading by the light of his nightlight. Can I come in? Bruno nodded. Chris sat down on the edge of the bed. I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen. Bruno set down his book. I installed cameras in the house, Chris said, after your accident. I told myself it was to keep you safe. And maybe it was at first, but it became something else. It became a way for me to feel like I had control. Like I could protect you from everything. Bruno's eyes widened. You've been watching me. Not all the time, but yes. And I'm sorry, I took them out of your room, but I should have told you sooner." Bruno was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Did you see me cry?" Chris's throat tightened. "Yes." "Did you see Grace help me?" "Yes." Bruno looked down at his hands. "I'm glad you saw that, because I don't think I could have told you." Chris felt tears sting his eyes. "I'm sorry, Bruno. For everything. For not being there the night of the accident. For trying to control everything. For not seeing you." Bruno looked up. "I don't blame you for the accident, Dad. I never did." Chris's breath caught. "You don't?" "No. I blame the guy who hit me, and I blame the chair, and I blame my legs, but not you." Chris pulled Bruno into a hug, and for the first time in 3 years they both cried. When they finally pulled apart, Bruno said, "I'll go to the gala." Chris blinked. "You will?" "Yeah. But not because you want me to, because I want to. Grace is right. Showing up is brave, and I want to be brave." Chris smiled through his tears. "Okay. But Dad?" "Yeah? No more cameras." Chris nodded. "No more cameras." The day of the gala arrived. Chris woke up with a knot in his stomach. The settlement hearing was at 10. The gala started at 6. He had to survive both. The hearing was brutal. The driver's lawyer was aggressive, painting Chris as a vindictive millionaire trying to ruin a man's life. Tom fought back, but the judge seemed unimpressed. In the end, the settlement was denied. No money, no justice, just a closed case. Chris left the courthouse feeling hollow. But he didn't have time to process it. The gala was in 6 hours. When he got home, the house was already buzzing with activity. Caterers, decorators, event staff. Everything was in motion. Chris found Grace in the kitchen helping Bruno get ready. Bruno was wearing a suit. His hair was combed. He looked older, more confident. "You look great," Chris said. Bruno smiled. "Thanks." Grace handed Bruno a small wooden box. "The music box. For courage," she said. Bruno took it, nodded, and slipped it into his pocket. At 6, the guests started arriving. Investors, donors, journalists. The house filled with chatter and laughter. Chris stood at the entrance, shaking hands, smiling, playing the part. But his mind was elsewhere. Where was Bruno? At 7, the event coordinator found him. "Mr. Benson, we're ready for your speech." Chris nodded. He walked to the podium in the main hall, looked out at the crowd, and took a breath. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began. 3 years ago, my son Bruno was in an accident that changed our lives forever, and for a long time I thought the only way to protect him was to control everything around him. But I was wrong. The room was silent. I've learned that protection isn't the same as hope, and hope doesn't come from control. It comes from trust, from connection, from people like Grace Peters, who reminded my son that he's more than what he's lost. Chris paused, his voice thick. "Bruno couldn't be here tonight." "Yes, I can." Chris turned. Bruno was at the back of the room, Grace beside him. The crowd parted as Bruno wheeled himself forward. Chris's breath caught. Bruno stopped in front of the podium and looked up at his father. "Can I say something?" Chris nodded, stepping aside. Bruno turned to the crowd, his voice was steady. "I didn't want to come tonight because I thought you'd all see me as inspiration, like I'm brave just for existing. But I'm not. I'm just a kid who got hurt. And for a long time, I hated that. I hated my chair. I hated being stuck." The room was silent. "But someone taught me that different doesn't mean gone, that my body remembers, that I'm more than this chair." Bruno pulled the music box from his pocket and set it on the podium. He wound it, and the soft melody filled the room. "This is hope," Bruno said. "Not a cure, not a miracle, just hope. And that's enough." The room erupted in applause. Chris stood beside his son, tears streaming down his face. and realized that this was the moment he'd been searching for. Not control, not protection, just presence. After the gala, after the guests had left and the house was quiet again, Chris found Grace in the kitchen. "Thank you," he said. Grace smiled. "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do. You gave him something I couldn't." Grace shook her head. "I didn't give him anything. I just reminded him of what was already there." Chris nodded. "Still, thank you." Grace picked up her bag. "I should go." "Grace, wait." She turned. "Why did you do it?" Chris asked. "Why did you care so much?" Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because I've been on the other side of rooms like this, and I know what it's like to feel invisible. I didn't want Bruno to feel that way." Chris felt his throat tighten. "Were you—" Grace nodded. "I was in a car accident when I was 16. Broke my back. Spent 2 years in a wheelchair before I could walk again. It was the hardest thing I've ever been through, but I had people who reminded me I was more than my injury, and I wanted to be that for Bruno." Chris stared at her, stunned. "I had no idea." "I know," Grace said, "and that's okay. It's not about me. It's about him." She smiled, then left. Chris stood alone in the kitchen, overwhelmed by gratitude and awe. Grace Peters had given his son hope, and in doing so, she'd given Chris something too, a second chance. The weeks that followed were different. Bruno started physical therapy with renewed energy, not because he thought he'd walk again, but because he wanted to see what his body could do. He and Grace continued their rhythm games, their adventure novel readings, their quiet conversations. Chris stopped watching the cameras. He dismantled most of them, keeping only the exterior security feeds. He learned to sit with discomfort, to trust, to be present. One evening, Chris found Bruno in the living room, tapping out a rhythm on his wheelchair. "What are you working on?" Chris asked. Bruno grinned. "A new song. Grace and I are going to perform it next week, for the staff." Chris smiled. "I can't wait to hear it." Bruno looked at his father. "Dad? Yeah? I'm glad you hired Grace." Chris felt his chest tighten. "Me too, buddy. Me too." That night, Chris sat in his office, not to work but to think. He thought about the accident, about the cameras, about control and fear and love. And he realized something. The greatest safety doesn't come from surveillance or money or control, it comes from trust. From connection, from people who see you, not as a problem to fix, but as a person to know. Chris had spent 3 years trying to protect his son from the world, but Grace had done something better. She'd reminded Bruno that he was still part of it. Before we wrap up, I want to hear from you. How did this story make you feel? And if you're comfortable, tell me where you're listening from, city or country, whatever feels right. I love knowing that these stories reach people all over the world. Drop a comment. I read every single one. Months later, Chris received a letter. It was from the driver who had hit Bruno. A handwritten apology. No excuses, just remorse. Chris read it twice, then set it down. He didn't feel anger. He didn't feel vindication. He just felt tired, but also, strangely, at peace. He showed the letter to Bruno. Bruno read it, then looked up. "Do you think he means it?" "I don't know," Chris said. "Does it matter?" Bruno thought for a moment. "I think it does, because if he means it, then maybe he'll be more careful, and maybe someone else won't get hurt." Chris nodded. "You're right." Bruno folded the letter and handed it back. "I forgive him." Chris felt tears sting his eyes. "You do?" "Yeah, because holding on to it just makes me tired, and I don't want to be tired anymore." Chris pulled his son into a hug. "I'm so proud of you." "Thanks, Dad." That evening, Grace came over for dinner. It had become a tradition. Once a week, she'd join them, and they'd cook together, laugh together, and just be together. As they sat around the table, Chris looked at the two people who had changed his life. Bruno, who had taught him that strength isn't about walking, it's about showing up, and Grace, who had taught him that love isn't about control, it's about trust. Thank you, Chris said, raising his glass, both of you, for reminding me what matters. Bruno grinned. You're welcome. Grace smiled. Any time. They clinked glasses, and for the first time in years, Chris felt whole. The mansion, once filled with silence and fear, now echoed with laughter. Bruno's physical therapy continued. Some days were hard. Some days were victories. But every day he showed up. Chris learned to let go, to trust, to be present without trying to fix everything. And Grace? She kept her promise, not as a job, but as something deeper. One afternoon, Chris found her in the garden with Bruno. They were planting flowers. What are you planting? Chris asked. Sunflowers, Bruno said. Grace says they always face the light. Chris smiled. That's a good lesson. Grace looked up. It's the only one that matters. Chris sat down beside them, hands in the dirt, and for the first time in years he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not in control, not in fear, just present. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that humanity is the greatest wealth of all, then do me a favor. Subscribe. Not for the algorithm, not because I asked, but because stories like this matter, because compassion matters, because hope matters. And if you believe that too, then you're exactly the kind of person I want in this community. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And remember, sometimes the greatest safety comes from trust.